I gave away everything. Every single thing I had ever owned, ever inherited, ever held close to my heart. I emptied my hands completely, and I did it willingly. I did it because 1,000 children were waiting in the dark, and the only thing standing between them and freedom was whether I was brave enough to let go of everything I had ever called mine. By the end of this story, you will understand why giving it all away was not the hardest decision of my life. It was the easiest. And that realization still takes my breath away every time I think about it. To understand why I made that choice, you have to go back to who I was before any of this happened. Before the heartbreak, before the sleepless nights, before I stood in front of a table covered in everything I owned and understood that none of it mattered as much as I thought it did. I was Sister Catherine. And my life was quiet. Beautifully, peacefully quiet. I woke before sunrise every morning at our small convent in rural Ohio. I prayed, I cooked, I tended the garden. I taught reading to children in our parish school on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. I was not wealthy. I never expected to be. But over the years, I had accumulated small things. A silver cross that belonged to my grandmother. A small wooden jewelry box my mother gave me the day I took my vows. A hand-stitched quilt that had been in my family for 3 generations. A few rare books. A modest savings account I had built through years of careful living. They were not much by the world's standards. But they were mine. They were pieces of who I was. I genuinely believed I had found my purpose inside those quiet convent walls. I believed my calling was to serve the people immediately around me, to love the people I could reach, and to trust that God would handle the rest of the world. I never once imagined that the rest of the world would come knocking on my door. It was a cold February morning when Sister Agnes, our eldest sister, placed a thin manila envelope on the breakfast table in front of me. She sat down slowly, folded her hands, and told me that a relief organization had contacted our diocese. They were reaching out to every religious community they could find because a crisis had developed at the border between 2 struggling nations that I will not name, because naming them is not the point. The point is what was happening to the children inside a cluster of overcrowded temporary camps. 1,000 children. Give or take. Separated from their families by conflict, by displacement, by circumstances entirely beyond their control. They had been identified by international aid workers, they had been registered and documented, and their cases had been processed for resettlement in safer environments. Everything was lined up on paper. But there was a wall none of the organizations could break through. A corrupt local administrative system that had placed an unofficial financial barrier on processing each child's release documentation. The organizations were calling it what it was, quietly and carefully. It was extortion. And the number they had been given to secure the release of every child was staggering. I remember sitting at that table after Agnes left the room. I stared at that envelope for a long time. I told myself it wasn't my problem. I told myself there were international organizations equipped to handle things like this. I told myself I was one nun in Ohio with a vegetable garden and a grandmother's silver cross. What could I possibly do? But something in me could not let it go. I kept thinking about the number. 1,000 children. Not a statistic. 1,000 individual small human beings who had names and fears and favorite foods and dreams they hadn't given up on yet. I couldn't shake it. So when the diocese asked if any volunteers would travel with the relief team to assess the situation firsthand, I raised my hand. I don't know exactly why. I think my hand knew something my mind was still arguing about. When I arrived at the camp 3 weeks later, nothing I had read or been told had prepared me for what I saw. And I am not going to describe it in a way meant to shock you. Because what broke me was not the physical condition of the place. What broke me was the children themselves. Their dignity. Their resilience. The way a 7-year-old girl named Amora pressed a hand-drawn picture into my palm within 20 minutes of meeting me, like she had been saving it for someone worth giving it to. The way a 12-year-old boy named Thomas taught himself English by listening to aid workers and then asked me, completely seriously, whether Ohio was near New York because he had heard New York was beautiful. I stayed for what was supposed to be 5 days. I stayed for 3 weeks. And when I finally came home, I was not the same person who had left. I knew that. My sisters in the convent knew that. Agnes looked at my face the morning I walked back through our door and she said, very quietly, "You're going back." Not a question. A statement. I just nodded. Because the relief organization had hit a wall. Donations were coming in but falling short. Political channels were moving too slowly. And every week that passed, every delay, every failed negotiation, meant another week those children stayed exactly where they were. I watched deadlines pass. I watched momentum stall. I watched organizations argue about jurisdiction while Amora was still in that camp drawing pictures and Thomas was still practicing English into the air. I started making calls. I reached out to every contact I had, which was not many. I wrote letters. I organized small fundraisers through our parish. We raised meaningful amounts. But we were still so far from what was needed. And the people around me started to gently, kindly suggest that I had done enough. That this was too large for one person. That I needed to accept my limits. I remember the night I sat alone in the chapel and had the most honest conversation with God I have ever had in my life. I told him I was exhausted. I told him I was scared. I told him I did not understand why this had fallen on my shoulders. And then somewhere in that silence, I stopped talking and I started listening. And what came to me in that quiet was not an answer. It was a question. A simple, terrible, clarifying question. What do you still have left to give? I walked back to my room. I opened my closet. I looked at my grandmother's silver cross. The wooden jewelry box. The quilt. The books. The savings account that I had built carefully and slowly over 23 years of religious life. And something shifted inside me. Permanently. Because I realized I had been thinking of those objects as mine. As part of my identity. And in that moment I understood they were not mine. They never had been. They were resources I had been holding. And there were children who needed those resources more than I needed to hold them. I sold everything. I did not do it impulsively. I prayed over every single item before I let it go. I ran my fingers over my grandmother's cross one last time and then I placed it in the hands of an antique buyer and I did not look back. I liquidated every dollar in my savings account. I reached out to our diocese, and to my deep gratitude, our bishop made a matching contribution from the community fund. And then something extraordinary happened that I still cannot explain entirely in human terms. The story got out. Someone in our parish mentioned what I was doing. A local newspaper picked it up. Then a radio station. And then something I did not ask for and did not expect. People began to respond. Strangers from across the country mailed envelopes to our convent. Small amounts, most of them. $10. $25. One woman from Arizona sent a handwritten note with $300 and said she had read my story while sitting in a hospital waiting room and decided that if I was willing to give everything, she could give something. I wept over that letter. I still have it. It is one of the only things I kept. But even then, even with all of that, we hit a wall. 2 weeks before the critical deadline, we were still short. The negotiations at the administrative level had broken down again. I was told the window might close entirely. That the documentation might expire. That we might lose the opportunity and have to start over from the beginning, months or years of process, for every single child. I remember standing in an airport, on the phone, being told it was over. And I felt something I had never felt before in my life. Not despair. Something colder than despair. An absolute stillness. Like the moment before something either collapses or holds. And then, 48 hours later, an attorney representing a private humanitarian foundation contacted the relief organization directly. They had seen the coverage. They were prepared to cover the remaining shortfall on the condition that the process move immediately and transparently. I don't know who that foundation was. I never found out the name. I'm not sure I was meant to. The documents were processed. The children were released in groups over the following 6 weeks. I was there for the final group. I was standing in a courtyard when the last bus arrived. And Amora walked off that bus and she saw me standing there. And she ran. She ran like the ground couldn't hold her fast enough. And she crashed into me and I held on to that little girl and I thought, this is what everything was for. Thomas found me later that afternoon. He was taller than I remembered. He looked at me for a moment with those serious 12-year-old eyes and he said, "Sister Catherine, is Ohio near New York?" And I laughed until I cried. When I came home, I had almost nothing. My room was sparse. My savings were gone. My grandmother's cross was in someone else's hands. And I sat in my empty room and waited for grief to come. But what came instead was a kind of lightness I had never experienced in my life. Like I had set down something incredibly heavy that I had been carrying for years without realizing it. I had spent 2 decades carefully accumulating small pieces of security, and every single one of them had turned out to be less important than I believed. I am not going to tell you my life became easy after that. It didn't. I struggled. There were days of exhaustion and grief and wondering whether I had made the right choices. There were nights I missed my grandmother's cross in a way that surprised me. But underneath all of it was a bedrock of peace I had never touched before. Because I knew with absolute certainty that I had given the most important thing a person can give. Not money. Not possessions. Myself. My time. My fear. My willingness to fail completely for the sake of something bigger than my comfort. The true measure of a person's life is not found in what they hold on to. It is found in what they release. In what they are willing to give away even when giving it away costs them everything they thought defined them. I gave away everything I owned. And in return, I received something no amount of money can buy. I received proof that one ordinary person, with empty hands and stubborn faith, can make the impossible possible. I want to ask you something. And I want you to think about it honestly. Do you believe you could have done it? Could you have emptied your hands completely for complete strangers? Leave your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think. And if this story moved you even a little, please share it. Share it because somewhere out there, someone needs to be reminded that one person's courage can change the lives of thousands. And that person might be you.